Hey everybody. So we are looking at section 20.2 today, which is evolutionary patterns and processes. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about change in species over time as related to things like the fossil record and how we understand that species changed in response to geological events. All right. And as part of that, we're going to look at mass extinctions versus background extinctions, two things that I think you're probably already at least a little familiar with. So we're going to talk about, first of all, here are 4 objectives for this section. So patterns that describe the sequential nature of groups in the fossil record. And for that, we're going to look back at our cladograms, which we originally discussed as part of chapter 19. We're going to look at fossil record again and how that indicates to us these periods of what we call gradualism and also punctuated equilibrium, which is going to be a newer term. We're going to talk about macroevolution, which is change on a broad scale, and then what happens during a process called coevolution, which is actually a pretty neat way by which species can adapt. All right, so when we talk about macroevolution, like I mentioned, these are broad, large-scale changes that occur in a whole clade. Like we're talking about multiple species that make up a group that have originally diverged from an ancestor back in time. Now, if you remember, this is an image of a cladogram, and we can see we have many different groups, many different clades being shown here. Now, remember, this is not indicative of them sharing any of these guys here as a common ancestor, just simply that these guys are related to some common ancestor back in time, right? So we have the group Dinosauria here, which we know a majority of these dinosaurs have died out, but there's one particular group that has survived uniquely kind of well from this, and those are what we know of for modern birds. You can see ostrich and an eagle and I'm not sure, a smaller bird of some sort here, maybe a hawk or something. But those modern birds we know did diverge from an ancestor back in time in this reptiles kind of clade. So birds, remember, are our closest ancestor, our closest relative, I should say, not ancestor, but relative to those dinosaurs that we've heard so much about in years past, right? And so this is that idea of macroevolution. We're talking about big, large-scale changes that creates new clades over time, all right? And so reptiles are very closely related to birds, just simply based on this, but you can see kind of that diverging process, all right, to get from one to the next. When we talk about extinctions, there are mass extinctions, and then there are what we call background extinctions. And on this slide, we're kind of seeing both. So here are the major periods of time back in geological history, and mass extinctions are going to be identified by these labels. I was going to say word banks. That's not what this is, but the labels that are provided here. So we have one at the end of the Ordovician period, one at the end of the Devonian, Permian, Triassic, and Cretaceous. And the end of the Cretaceous is the one we talk about the most with the extinction of the dinosaurs. But below that, below all those peaks, we have these periods of what we call background extinctions. The major difference between those is really what you're seeing right here. In a mass extinction event, we're seeing a large percentage of the living species at the time dying out, right? So we have a percent of genera becoming extinct here. And at the end of the Permian, the one that was most significant, it looks like nearly 40% of all living things just completely died out. Triassic and Cretaceous are very similar. They're around 25%, 22%, something like that. And that's what we would characterize as being a mass extinction event. Notice my background extinctions here are operating anywhere between about 0 and 10%. So we know on average there are always going to be species that are kind of dying out and species that are being created. But in general, if they're dying out and going extinct more frequently than they are being created, we can run into these mass extinction types of events. And you've probably heard that in the past, when we talk about the mass extinction of the dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous period, you could think about, there was this asteroid that we all know hit the Earth, and it, resulted in all this ash and soot being kicked up in the atmosphere, which deprived the Earth of sunlight, and plant life suffered, and so on and so forth. But in reality, what scientists tend to think about is that it's not simply one event. It's not simply an asteroid or a meteor or anything else that causes this. it's kind of the interaction of multiple things. So there's some level of climate change. It may be that sea levels rise. It may be volcanic eruptions and continental plates that are moving. But mass extinction is driven by a number of factors, kind of all combining at the same time in a way in which multiple millions of species are impacted kind of equally. So entire ecosystems get shut down, food chains are completely wiped out, and those that end up surviving have to be able to adapt to this new reality of what the world looks like, right? So there may be new niches to fill. There may be new diets that they have to kind of come to terms with and learn how to consume other types of food products. There's going to be a whole lot less competition. And so for those that do survive, they can kind of very quickly increase their population size. But it's a difficult time for kind of across the board for everybody, okay, when we talk about these mass extinctions. But the background ones are the ones that we kind of tend to see normally. I thought I had an image here. Let me see. Oh, I see. Okay, let me go back. So when we talk about these evolutionary processes and their responses, right? When I was saying, either these species are adapting and creating new groups or they're dying out, right? So when we talk about evolution, Darwin, we know, tends to think of evolution as a gradual process, just like we know a lot of the geological events that we've been talking about are also fairly gradual, right? Like the movement of those tectonic plates is pretty gradual until they smash into each other, right? And build mountains and cause volcanic eruptions and earthquakes and all those things. And so he called that process gradualism, and we'll see what that looks like here on the next slide. But the idea is that things change gradually. They change slowly and pretty continuously throughout time. Horseshoe crabs is one specific example that your textbook brings up at this point, and they like to talk about the fact that horseshoe crabs are pretty ancient. They're pretty archaic in that a lot of their structures tend to be kind of conserved over time. They haven't changed all that much, even though genetically they may be different. Their body structures haven't adapted in any way. And if you've ever seen a horseshoe crab, they really kind of do look ancient. It looks like you're looking at some creature from way back in time, even though they're right here on the beaches in the United States down south, right? I mean, it's crazy. But we like to think of them as being kind of in a state of equilibrium where they are changing a little bit, but those major body structures, what we use to identify, like when we look at them as a horseshoe crab, just those aren't changing. Punctuated equilibrium is a little bit different, and that's this idea that things change rapidly over time. So unlike gradualism, which is a slow, kind of steady process, punctuated equilibrium says, okay, well, there can be these gradual changes, but all of a sudden, every once in a while, we have these like bursts in diversity and variety. We have these bursts in creation of new species. And so in other words, that becomes a little bit more rapid in terms of how we evolve and species change over time. Let me move myself up a little bit. So here's kind of a comparison of those two general theories, and neither one of these is really right or wrong all the time. Scientists kind of think there's maybe a mixture of both of these. When we talk about gradualism, we're looking at, again, that slow and steady change in a particular line of descent. And so you can see there's a little bit more fluid in how it's happening, right? The timelines may be the same for both of these, but the way that they separate and become more different to create new species is different. We don't have in gradualism these like bursts and immediate changes in things. We get this slow and steady accumulation of adaptations that can be beneficial or maybe, things that could be detrimental to a group. In punctuated equilibrium, we have stable periods of time where things remain kind of steady and at an equilibrium, kind of like horseshoe crabs. And then we have these rapid events that are going to change a species kind of dramatically, all occurring at once. And these could be caused by those kind of rapid geological events, right? Where we have a volcanic eruption and things have to change like right away to maybe find a new food source, right? Maybe occupy a new niche, find a new role for that particular environment. And so punctuated equilibrium is kind of emphasizing we have these points like here, right? And here, and these kind of stand out in this diagram where we're getting these rapid kind of increases in evolution over time. All right, so again, going back to those same questions, we just kind of talked about them. When we think about horseshoe crabs specifically, we tend to focus on what we're going to say here as this kind of punctuated equilibrium idea, which is that they can be at this state of equilibrium where they're not changing much. But it may be that in the future something happens and they, boom, kind of have to respond to that, and their body structures change as a response. So it just kind of depends on environmentally what's happening. That determines which type of evolution is actually allowable at the time, right? Can it be slow and steady, or does it need to be quick? So adaptive radiation is one of those ideas that can tie in with both gradualism and punctuated equilibrium, in that we're looking at species diverging, becoming more and more different, and starting from an ancestor and becoming different groups over could be a very short period of time. And so if we think about this is an example of these clades of mammals, really. And mammals following that Cretaceous period, that mass extinction, really kind of adaptively radiated from what remained on the earth, right? Like we had mammals starting to develop at that point. And from that time, they were able to kind of start occupying niches all over the world in different ecosystems and adapting to those ecosystems and those food supplies and the competition there and the other organisms found. And they became very, very different, right? We have some that live in water ecosystems. We have some that live in grasslands. We have others that live in desert-like environments, right? And jungles and forests. And so the unique ability of animals to kind of adapt and change in response to basically the wipeout of the majority of species on the earth was kind of significant, right? Adaptive radiation we see often in places like the Hawaiian Islands and other island species where, for birds and tortoises, they can spread out in those spaces. And when they stay isolated in those locations, that's when they start to kind of adapt pretty, not frequently, but rapidly. Okay. So tying in with both of those also is this idea of what we call convergent evolution. And I think we talked about divergent evolution in 18, if I remember correctly. But convergent evolution is looking at here how species develop similar characteristics in different parts of the world. And so, again, what this references is going back to these ideas of homologous structures and analogous structures, if you remember those. In general, convergent evolution involves analogous structures, which are not representations of relationships. They don't indicate any type of evolutionary relationship or ancestors shared. All that those analogous structures tell us is that these species needed them for a specific purpose. So with an analogous structure, like in this example, you can see they're trying to point out wings, okay? So all of these species had developed wings, not because they're all related to each other, but because they all needed to be able to fly, right? It's part of their niche, it's part of their behavior, it's part of their role, it's part of how they survive and obtain food. So you have bats here, which are mammals, which are unrelated to birds, which are unrelated to insects, which are unrelated to these fossils called Archaeopteryx from many, many years ago. And so they all may have wings, and we say that they all developed those similar characteristics. They kind of converged upon all having wings, but the difference was, they don't come from the same place. They just simply all needed that trait to be able to survive. Okay. And the last thing we need to talk about here, I believe, let me make sure. Yeah. Is coevolution. So when we talk about coevolution, this is kind of, I think, one of the coolest ways that species can develop. If you think back to our Latin roots, co meant with or together. And when we talk about coevolution, this is two species evolving together. So they're evolving to changes occurring one in another. And the best example of this, I think, and we'll talk about this in a second, but would be of hummingbirds and the flowers that they feed upon. So if you've ever seen hummingbirds out in the wild or seen videos or have them maybe at your house, you know that hummingbirds that come to feeders, like hummingbird feeders, if you put them outside your house, tend to have red colors. Like they tend to have red flowers, or maybe flowers with a little yellow speck in the middle, but they tend to be red somewhere on that feeder. So hummingbirds have learned over time that the flowers that produce the nectar that they need to consume in order to keep up their high energy, right? You think about how quickly their wings are moving. Those flowers tend to be red in color. And the reason why that is those flowers have adapted and producing that red color to attract hummingbirds. So think about how they both benefit. So the hummingbirds go to the flower. The hummingbird obtains nectar from the flower, which is a super sugary, high energy substance, right? The flower itself is going to benefit because a hummingbird is a pollinator. So the hummingbird has the ability to transfer pollen from one red flower to another in another location, right? So the more red flowers a hummingbird visits, the more pollen gets transferred, the more reproduction happens for these flowers. In addition to that, the flowers have developed like these long tube-like structures in the hummingbird's beaks. If you've ever seen those, are like teeny narrow beaks that can fit perfectly well into those long tube-like flower structures. So they've kind of evolved in response to one another to ensure the flowers are being pollinated and then the hummingbirds are getting the food that they need to be able to survive. This is a caterpillar that will eventually form a monarch butterfly, all right? And you notice the coloration. Generally, out in the wild, this is a coloration that would indicate this thing is dangerous. And it is. The hummingbird, not hummingbird, excuse me, I'm going back. This caterpillar that will eventually form a monarch butterfly can obtain and actually eat toxins from a plant called a milkweed plant. And that milkweed plant makes them somewhat toxic to birds. So if a bird comes along and picks off this caterpillar that's ingested this milkweed toxin, the bird's going to get really, really sick. And so the birds essentially learn, well, I don't want to touch those, right? So the milkweed toxin has impacted the caterpillar in a beneficial way because it helps it to stay alive. Milkweed doesn't hurt the caterpillar itself. It'll eventually turn into a monarch butterfly and go on about its business, okay? But there are other types of caterpillars, other types of butterflies, and even other insects that develop the same trait, like they have the same coloration pattern because it becomes beneficial for survival. So as the monarch caterpillars develop, over time, other insects have learned to kind of mimic this pattern so that they can also be protected. Because again, if a bird eats this by mistake and it is toxic, the bird's going to get sick. And so the bird's not going to want to eat any other living things that look like this. And so anybody that develops this banding pattern with the yellows, blacks, and whites is essentially going to be protected. And so this is an example of, again, the monarch is going to be protected, but the mimics also are going to be protected. And in addition to that, that toxin that the monarchs have learned to kind of deal with and survive is going to be protective in addition to that to the monarchs. So these are just a couple examples. There are a whole lot more. When we were talking about symbiosis way back at the start of the year, almost all of those mutualistic, commensalistic, parasitic types of relationships are all based on coevolution. So there's a lot of cool stuff we could talk about with this, but I'm going to save my breath at this point and call it quits for now. So that's all I've got for 20.2. If you have any questions for me, as always, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you next time. Bye, guys.